KORCHNOY SPASSKY, Final of the World Championship Candidates Tournament by Raymond Keene. Viktor Korchnoi, the Solzhenitsyn of chess, has earned the right to challenge Anatoly Karpov of the USSR for the World Chess Championship. I have just returned from Belgrade, where, in cooperation with Michael Steen, I was acting as Korchnoi's second in his candidates' final match against Boris Spassky. There were 18 games played, and of these Korchnoi won 7, numbers 2, 3, 7, 8, 10, 17 and 18, while Spassky took games 11, 12, 13 and 14 in a row, and the remaining 7 were drawn. As you can see, this was a most bloodthirsty and exciting match for such a high level of chess. But the match also reached a pitch of drama for reasons quite unconnected with skill on the chessboard. A drama that made headlines in the press in a way quite unknown since Spassky Fischer 5.5 years ago. Now, the way I'm going to deal with this subject is first of all to sketch in the details of the scandal that broke out during the match. Then I'll move on and analyze a couple of games in great detail, and I'll conclude by giving a few positions from the more exciting encounters. But before I start on sketching in the details of the scandal, I should introduce you to a few of the actors. Of course, we start off with Korchnoi and Spassky themselves. Then, the ladies accompanying them. Korchnoi had Petra Lerverik as his secretary, while Spassky had his wife Marina. Marina is a French woman, and she's also Spassky's third wife. Then there was Bozidar Karzic, the chief arbiter. He's a native of Belgrade, and he had a really tough time in this match, I can assure you. Spassky's second was Igor Bondarevsky, a 60-year-old Russian grandmaster, who's helped Spassky very much in the past. Korchnoi was assisted by myself, Michael Steen, and the Israeli master, who was also an ex-Russian, Yasha Murray. Now, another person who played a very important role in Belgrade was the president of the World Chess Federation, Dr. Max Erver. Then, you should know who was on the arbitration committee. Now, the arbitration committee is the body that's meant to make all the important decisions when protests or disputes arise. And the arbitration committee consisted of Karzic, myself, Bondarevsky, and 2 Yugoslavs. The second arbiter, Jaya, and the representative of the Yugoslav Chess Federation, which was sometimes Petronic and sometimes Bozic. Now, I should also describe the way in which the stage looked for the first 11 games. This is absolutely central to any understanding of what went on after game 10. The games were played in a building known as the Hall of Trade Unions, the Dom Sindicata. Now, this building contained one large auditorium, seating several thousand people, and the match was played on the stage of this theatre. In the center of the stage, there was a table with a chessboard on it, with Korchnoi sitting on one side of the table and Spassky on the other, as is normal in chess tournaments. At the front of the stage, invisible to the players, was a huge electronic demonstration board, which was operated from the back of the stage. This was clearly there for the benefit of the public to follow the game. In the middle of the stage, further back from the players, and easily visible to both of them, was a manually operated demonstration board. Behind each player, there was a closed relaxation box. Of course, there was one entry to both boxes, but this was behind the stage, and any player sitting in the relaxation box was invisible to his opponent and to the arbiter. Now, it was agreed at the start of the match that Spassky's box should be behind Korchnoi's chair, and Korchnoi's box behind Spassky's chair. But it was also assumed that these boxes would only be used for relaxation by a player who wasn't on the move. Now that's sketched in the technical details of the stage and the actors, and now I'll try and explain what precisely it was that happened in Belgrade. The first 9 games inclusive, the situation was normal. The results were absolutely excellent for us, since Korchnoi had won 4 games and 5 had been drawn. But the conflict had been confined entirely to the chessboard. With game 10, something really weird started, which I shall now try to explain. After a few moves in game 10, it became quite clear that Spassky was refusing to sit at the chessboard when Korchnoi was there. We began to observe that he was hiding in his box behind Korchnoi's chair, and he would only come out of his box to make moves on the board, and then he'd vanish again. Well, at first I thought that Spassky had prepared the opening variation very deeply in home analysis, and that he was simply going off to get a cup of coffee or to eat something, and as soon as he came back, he was making his move quickly, and then going off to finish his meal. Other people suggested that Spassky's long absences from the board were connected with diarrhea or other physical reasons. But by the time the middle game had come about, it was absolutely obvious that Spassky was analyzing the game from the central demonstration board, the manually operated one, and was sitting in the armchair in his box, and only coming to the board to make the move, and then he would vanish again. There was even one case when we saw Spassky come out of his box, saunter up to the board, make the move without even sitting down, and then walk back to the box again. Now, it was quite obvious to everybody watching this game that Korchnoi was upset by this, but he didn't make any kind of formal protest. And eventually, in mutual time trouble, Spassky was forced to come to sit at the chessboard. If he'd carried on this trick of sitting in the box the whole time and only coming to the board to make his move, he'd certainly have lost on time. And when he came to the board, he succeeded in throwing away an excellent position that he'd built up. And when the game was adjourned, Korchnoi had won a pawn and had some chances to win the game. Now, the 10th game was adjourned, and we decided, that is Korchnoi, myself, and Michael Steen, that Korchnoi should take time out for the adjourned session. That meant that he could postpone it for a few days, and give himself much more time to analyze the complexities, and thus increase his winning chances. Now, we also had a discussion amongst ourselves as to whether we should protest immediately against Spassky's strange behavior. Now, I claimed that this new method of playing, one might call it an indirect method of playing chess, was illegal on 2 counts. First of all, it contravened the rule that one should not disturb one's opponent. Well, you can disturb your opponent in many ways. You can disturb him by smoking, but people have been smoking for as long as chess has been played. Well, not quite as long, but as long as competitive tournament chess has been played, people have been smoking. And it's very, very difficult to complain about an opponent who's smoking a cigar or smoking a pipe. But if somebody invents a new way of upsetting the opponent, well, I think it's legitimate to complain about it, and the arbiter should stop it. So Spassky had developed this entirely new method of playing. It disturbed Korchnoi, and therefore I felt it was illegal. Now, a second point is that Article 19 of the Rules of Chess sternly forbids anyone to use 2 sets on which to analyze his moves. And quite clearly, Spassky was using the demonstration board to analyze on, and the ordinary chessboard. Well, everybody analyzes on the demonstration board during a tournament when it's not his turn to move. People often go and sit in the corner and stare at the demonstration board and think about the position when their opponent's thinking about his move at the board. it's quite unknown for someone to spend all his time analysing all his moves from an armchair away from the board, watching the demonstration board. I even thought of a third legal objection, which really isn't very serious, but it does say, I think it's the second rule in the rule book of chess, that the chessboard is placed between the players. And if Korchnoi was sitting at the board and Spassky was considering his move in his box, the two players were actually sitting in a straight line with Spassky behind Korchnoi's back. Well, that's a bit of a quibble, actually, but you can see there's some kind of basis for a legal complaint there. But the main point is that Spassky's behavior was disturbing, and it was novel, and therefore it should have been forbidden. Well, this was the argument I presented to Korchnoi and Steen, but Korchnoi was rather reluctant to cause any dispute, and instead of protesting, he sent a mild letter to the chief arbiter in which he inquired whether Spassky was disturbed by any object on the stage, whether he wanted to change the pieces, whether his health was okay. And Korchnoi offered to change the pieces, change the chessboard, or do anything to accommodate Spassky if this behavior of Spassky would come to an end. Well, Spassky sent a very oblique reply, which we rather interpreted as meaning that he would in fact obey the normal conduct for chess games for the following game. But of course he didn't make any firm commitment to this, and perhaps we should have put in our firm complaint at this point. Anyway, the 10th game was still adjourned, and meanwhile the 11th game was played. Now for the 11th game, as Spassky repeated his behavior from the 10th game, he did exactly the same thing. He didn't come to the chessboard, he just sat in his box behind Korchnoi's chair and worked out his strategy from there. Well, by this time Korchnoi was thoroughly upset by all this. I think what upset him most was that Spassky's behavior created a strange mood in the audience. They began to think that it wasn't a serious chess match anymore, it was some kind of spectacle like a circus. And Korchnoi was a very sensitive man, and he felt this kind of ridicule in the audience reflected onto the stage. And of course he was alone on the stage all the time and had to bear the full brunt of this. And the result was that he played really weakly and lost rather quickly. And at the end of this game, the 11th game, we finally decided that we had to issue a stern protest and try and put this behavior of Spassky's to an end. Well, you might say, why was it that Korchnoi couldn't just laugh off Spassky's box play? I know many people, for example Larsen, who would accept this behavior as strange, maybe even illegal, but wouldn't see any terrible harm in it. They might feel a bit insulted, but they regard the practical advantages of having an opponent analysed from a box away from the chessboard as outweighing any kind of insult that is implied. I think Larsen would just have shrugged his shoulders, thought his opponent was a lunatic, and carried on playing. But there are some players who have a kind of sensitivity that prevents this shrugging of the shoulders and just carrying on playing. And I know many people who become extremely upset by this strange kind of behavior, and Korchnoi is one of them. And he simply couldn't accept that his opponent was behaving like a clown during the games. It truly upset him, and he found it impossible to shrug it off. So, as Korchnoi's official second, I protested to Karzic, the chief arbiter. And the result was that Karzic made a decision to alter the conditions on the stage in such a way that Spassky would have to sit at the board. And what he decided was this: that the central demonstration board, the manually operated one from which Spassky was analysing, should be removed from the back of the stage and brought forwards to the front of the stage, so that it balanced the electronic demonstration board on the right-hand side of the stage. So there would be two demonstration boards at the front of the stage, electronic on the right, seen from the public's point of view, and manual on the left. Both demonstration boards would therefore be invisible to the players. That is, unless they walked off the stage and came out to sit in the auditorium, which would have been illegal. Now, the result of this was that Bondarevsky, who was Spassky's second, protested against the decision, and the machinery in Belgrade for dealing with protests was to summon the appeal committee. And the appeal committee, whose members I outlined before, would make a decision on the propriety of the chief arbiter's plan to move the demonstration board, and they would communicate it to the players, and this decision would be final. Well, the appeal committee met on the morning of the 12th game. The fact that this dispute had arisen meant that the adjourned 10th game was still unfinished. The appeal committee met, we argued for hours, and Bondarovsky produced a large number of specious reasons to justify Spassky's play. One of them, which I found particularly sickening, was that the match no longer had any sporting interest in view of Korchnoy's vast lead. Spassky simply wanted to be able to play a few good games of chess before he lost the match, and therefore he was trying to find some way of improving his concentration. Well, I said to Bondarovsky, if the match no longer has any sporting interest, let Spassky resign it, and I'm sure Korchnoi will be quite happy to play all the rest of the games as exhibition games, and Spassky can play as many good games as he wants under any conditions he likes. Well, I got no answer to this. Another specious argument that Bondarovsky produced was that all grandmasters use the demonstration board to analyze from. Well, as I said before, that's quite true, they do, but they only do it when it's their opponent's turn to move. They don't use the demonstration board exclusively to analyze when it's their own move. So, after many hours of wrangling and haggling, Bondarovsky's protest was rejected. Bondarovsky voted for it, of course, but I voted against it. Mr. Jaya, who was the second arbiter in Belgrade, voted against it. Petronic, the representative of the Yugoslav Chess Federation, voted against it. And Karzic, who had made the original decision, voted against it by implication. That meant it was thrown out by 4-1. So Spassky was going to have to play the 12th game sitting at the board, or else sitting in his box and analyzing the game without sight of any board. So, come the 12th game that afternoon, Spassky didn't show up. Korchnoi waited for an hour in an empty hall, and then Karzic awarded him the game by default. Now, Korchnoi made what I considered to be a terrible mistake. He was much too generous and much too honest. He said that he didn't want to take a point gained in this way, and he refused to accept the point by default based on Spassky's non-appearance. And he said that this loss should be transformed into Spassky's third time out. Each player is allowed 3 timeouts for illness, and so far Spassky had taken 2, and that meant that he would have none left, but at least he wouldn't lose the game. Well, in my opinion, this was insanely chivalrous. You may remember that in a similar situation, in 1972, in the Spassky-Fischer match, Fischer defaulted the second game, and Spassky gladly took the point, although it jeopardized the future course of the match. Well, Korchnoi didn't want to jeopardize the future course of this match. He wanted to win it fair and square, and that's why he didn't take the point. But this overly fair decision on his part jeopardized his own chances in the match, as we will see. Anyway, at this point, Spassky was already making threats to abandon the match and walk out of it, unless the original conditions were restored. And Dr. Erwer flew from Amsterdam to Belgrade to try and resolve the crisis. Meanwhile, the adjourned 10th game was finally played off, and since Korchnoi held an advantage, and had also thoroughly analysed the position, he didn't object to playing it off under the conditions that Spassky was now using. He didn't object when Spassky played the game from his box. And although the position was only slightly in Korchnoi's favour, Korchnoi managed to win it fairly easily, thus regaining his 4-point lead. Now, there's something I should mention about this 10th game. the adjourned games weren't played in the main hall, they were played in a slightly smaller theatre. And this meant that the audience was much more clearly visible to the players, and also the players were much closer to each other, even when one of them was sitting in a box. Now, during this second session of the 10th game, Korchnoi looked at Spassky sitting in his box. Now, Spassky later protested that this was an infringement of his rights, but I think that a player absolutely has the right to see his opponent when it's his opponent's move. And if the opponent's sitting in a box closed on three sides, then the player has the right to look at this opponent when he's sitting in such a box. Well, you can form your own opinion on that, but I think that any club player would be very, very unhappy if he simply couldn't see his opponent during a match, and the opponent only came to his board to make his move. And one could suspect that the opponent was getting help from some quarter, or perhaps analysing on a pocket set, or maybe even getting some kind of message from a deaf aid. And all these possibilities are a little bit remote, but they are possibilities. And I think that it is the player's duty to be visible when it's his move. So, Korchnoi won the 10th game, and there followed some periods of negotiation between Spassky, Korchnoi, and Erva. Now, the upshot of this negotiation, as we thought, was that Spassky should be allowed to play the game from his box, but that his box should be shifted to behind his own chair, and it should also be opened on two sides, so that although the public couldn't see him, his opponent and the arbiter could see him while he was thinking about his move. Well, this was a compromise that Korchnoi agreed to very reluctantly. But Dr. Erva, in order to continue the match and to prevent Spassky from leaving, had, in my opinion, given in to Spassky's blackmail and decided to reverse the decision of Karzic and the appeal committee to remove the manual demonstration board to the front of the stage. And Dr. Erva decided, with the power of the General Assembly, which he has in such crises, to shift the demonstration board back to the center of the stage where Spassky could see it. Well, that's what we thought the agreement was. But when we finally got detailed plans and a letter from Erva and Karzic setting out the proposals for the 13th and following games, sorry, the 12th game and following games, we saw that what we thought we'd agreed to had not in fact been carried out. And the official plan for the 12th game was that although the boxes should be opened, and that Spassky should be visible to Korchnoi and to the arbiter, his box should still be behind Korchnoi's chair, and not in front of it. This meant that when Korchnoi was playing, he had the feeling of somebody boring into his back with his eyes, and Korchnoi didn't like this at all. Now, I protested against that, but since the decision had been made by the chief arbiter, the two Yugoslavs on the appeal committee were very reluctant to support my protest, and I withdrew it when it was quite clear that I wasn't getting anywhere with it. So, Korchnoi had to play the 12th game under conditions to which he'd never agreed. But Dr. Erva did promise me that he would be present on the stage for the whole game to make sure that Spassky didn't do anything stupid. Well, Korchnoi played the 12th game, but he was very upset about these conditions, and he lost on time in a position where he was winning. I'm not trying to say by this comment that he was winning the whole game. It was a game of fluctuating fortunes, and the advantage swung backwards and forwards. But when Korchnoi lost on time, he was actually standing much better. Well, Korchnoi also lost the 13th game, still playing under these conditions that he never agreed to. And the 13th game was really rather absurd. It was one of the greatest tragedies in the history of the candidates tournament, and can only be ranked with the game Petrosian-Bronstein, played in the second round of the candidates tournament at Amsterdam in 1956. Well, you may remember that Petrosian, in a completely winning position, put his queen on prise, or rather left his queen on prise against Bronstein, thus ruining what would have been a great chess masterpiece, and also destroying Petrosian's chances to win the tournament. Korchnoi did the same thing against Spassky in the 13th game. he built up an excellent position. He missed one chance to decide the game in his favour by direct attack, and then he brought the game to an abrupt conclusion when, in a slightly advantageous position, he first of all blundered away a bishop, and then he put his queen on prise. Now, it was quite clear that this had nothing to do with chess at all. This was a series of blunders caused by nervous tension and by frustration. We decided after this disaster that Korchnoi had to take a rest, and he took the rest over the new year. But we also at this time issued an ultimatum to the tournament organization that the conditions absolutely had to be changed. Otherwise, Korchnoi was not going to continue the match. Now, we realized quite well that the full demands of our ultimatum, which included playing in a closed room, getting rid of the demonstration board, and other demands of a similar nature, would not be carried out. But we'd realized by this stage that the only way to gain a small concession, or at least to restore a small vestige of normality, was to demand too much. Well, as it was, this psychological stratagem worked out very well, and for the 14th game, the arbiters and Dr. Erwer made the decision that the boxes should stay open, but their position should be reversed, i.e. the box of Spassky should be behind Spassky's chair, and the box of Korchnoi behind Korchnoi's chair. Now, this was exactly what we'd asked for, and it was what we thought we'd agreed to after the 11th game. But now at last it was carried out. Unfortunately, in the 14th game, Korchnoi decided to try and play in the same way as Spassky. He decided to try and play from his box as well. Now, this was a severe blunder, and we criticized him for it afterwards. Korchnoi tried to use this box method, but he wasted far too much time and got into serious time trouble. And it was during the 14th game that we began to understand quite what strange gamesmanship weapon Spassky was trying to dream up to upset his opponent. Now, there came a point during the 14th game when Korchnoi was in really serious time trouble. He had to make about 10 moves in 2 minutes. And at this point, Spassky came to the board, sat down at the board permanently, but he put on a large, bright silver sun visor. Now, there was really no need for this as far as we could see. The only point of it was to upset Korchnoi by doing something strange. And of course, the reaction of the audience was to break out into whistles and jeers and cheering and shouting. And I think that was just what Spassky wanted. He wanted to create a strange atmosphere of tension, excitement, and even ridicule in the audience, which would put Korchnoi off. And he was brilliantly successful in this. Korchnoi demanded immediately that the curtain be drawn across the stage to try and keep out the noise. This was done, and the rest of the game was played off behind the drawn curtains, and only visible on the large electronic demonstration board. And it was really a very strange scene. There were the closed curtains. Nobody could see any of the play at all, but there were moves played at great speed on the electronic demonstration board. Meanwhile, the audience was going berserk, cheering, shouting, jeering, whistling, banging their feet, shouting imprecations. It was a very weird scene. Eventually, Korchnoi blundered away a rook. Sorry, well, it wasn't a whole rook, it was just the exchange. It was quite enough to lose the game. And when the game was adjourned, he had a completely hopeless position. Well, he decided to play off the game, and next day the adjourned 14th game was played off in the small hall, and he duly lost it. Now, at this stage in the match, Korchnoi's vast lead had dwindled to 1 point. And he'd lost 4 games in a row. That had never happened to him before in his life. But somehow he managed to pull himself together. Now, the first stage in pulling himself together and restoring his psychological balance was to write an apology to the arbiter, the organization committee, and the public for his behavior in copying Spassky's Matchbox method of play in the 14th game. He said that he'd never agreed with this kind of play. He'd done it in desperation, and now he bitterly repented of it. And this seemed to get it off his chest. And when the 15th game came, the audience was massively in his favour. They applauded him for 5 minutes at the start of the game, and it was obvious that the audience was now behind him. They'd appreciated what strange things Spassky was doing, and they now supported Korchnoi about 90%. And this huge ovation really encouraged him, and he managed to play much better in the 15th game. Korchnoi held a slight advantage for the whole game, and eventually Spassky had to try and force a draw. So at last Korchnoi had broken down this run of defeats. Came the 16th game. Korchnoi got a slight advantage out of the opening and the early middle game, but he got into time trouble towards the end of the session, and he adjourned in slightly the worse position. Now, it was possible to draw this, but it could have been difficult. But we'd noticed in previous games that had been adjourned that Spassky's adjournment analysis, presumably done with Bondarevsky, wasn't quite the best. This had become clear from the 8th game and from the 10th game. And where we had expected a long, difficult struggle to try and make a draw, Spassky actually forced a draw by repetition right at the start of the session and avoided the main line, which we considered rather dangerous for black. Perhaps Spassky was just afraid of our good adjournment analysis, I don't know, but the effect was disastrous for him, because this completely restored Korchnoi's confidence. Not only did he now feel that the audience was behind him, he also felt that Spassky was afraid of him. And from this point on, he didn't look back. In the 17th game, Spassky got the worst position from the opening, and Korchnoi managed to create a situation where he had a tiny but durable advantage. And Spassky also got into time trouble. Now, in the 17th game, Spassky accentuated the psychological trick he'd adopted of using the sun visor in game 14. And if you can imagine it, the sun visor looked rather like an Aborigines boomerang. Not a brown boomerang, but a kind of silvery white boomerang. And instead of wearing this thing, Spassky was holding it in his hand and ambling backwards and forwards across the stage. So he did rather look, in fact, like an Australian Aborigine with a boomerang in his hand. Well, he tried wearing this during the game, and it didn't have much effect. And at the end, he got into time trouble, as I said before, and he had to come to the board to analyze his moves. Now, not content with the sun visor, he also tried wearing a pair of dark glasses, and finally, in desperation, when his position was really crumbling, he put on a pair of skin diver's goggles. Now, that's quite incredible, and I think really that the arbiter should have stopped him from doing this. But Karzic was really quite afraid of causing an incident, in view of what had gone before, and he maintained a very low profile. Well, as it was, the sun visor, the dark glasses, and the aquatic goggles didn't help Spassky at all. And when he adjourned, he was a pawn down, or about to be a pawn down, and his situation was quite serious. We analysed for a very long time that night, and in fact I don't believe that Michael went to bed at all. But next morning we discovered that the position was probably a win, although some variations were extremely difficult. But once again, as in games 8, 10, 16, Spassky's adjournment analysis had been extremely defective, and by the time I got to the tournament hall, Korchnoi had won. So Victor was now 2 points up, with only 3 games to go. Now, the night before the 18th game, I dreamt that Korchnoi, who had black, won decisively and finished the match off in great style. Now, some people might say this was a kind of mystical prediction, but I think it was more likely sheer wish fulfillment, because to be frank, I'd dreamt before almost every game that Korchnoi won. And this hadn't applied to the games 11 to 14. Anyway, Korchnoi defended with the French defence, as he had done in so many times before, and a very tense middle game emerged. Spassky, of course, was trying on his various devices, and he was also getting the better position. But at move 34, Korchnoi did something rather subtle. He offered a draw. Now, the position was quite unclear at this point. Spassky was a pawn ahead, but he had some difficulties to cope with. But this offer of a draw was a masterstroke. And it had been established at the beginning of this box dispute that the only way in which Korchnoi could offer Spassky a draw when Spassky was sitting in his box was through the arbiter. Now, of course, if Korchnoi had come to Spassky's box and addressed Spassky personally, "Excuse me, Mr. Spassky, I'd like to offer you a draw," Spassky would have protested that Korchnoi was molesting him. So Erva and Karzic had both agreed that the only way for Korchnoi to offer a draw to Spassky in the box was through the medium of the arbiter. And at move 34, Korchnoi did this. And the arbiter came to Spassky and offered the draw. And, of course, this was a kind of infringement of his privacy in the box. Although, as I've argued before, he shouldn't have been in the box at all. And now Spassky's reaction was rather violent. He immediately accused Karzic of disturbing him. He said the offer was illegal. He said he was terribly upset. And he refused it. Well, whether he should have refused it, in view of the difficult nature of the position, and in view of the fact that he felt he was upset, is an open question. But he did refuse it, and he very soon went hopelessly wrong. And he adjourned in a quite serious position where it might have been possible to make a draw, but only if the sealed move was the correct one. Now, at the end of the session, on the stage, the audience, and I saw this as well, witnessed a very strange spectacle. Spassky started shouting at Karzic that he disturbed him, and Korchnoi shouted back quite audibly to the whole audience that it was impossible for him to offer a draw by normal means, since Spassky was in the box. And at this point, Spassky shook his fist at Korchnoi. Now, this was really a very strange goings-on for a candidates tournament. Well, we analysed the adjourned position that night for a long time, and eventually came to the conclusion that Black had some small winning chances. Black was Korchnoi, of course. And next day, Korchnoi set off at 10-4 to play the game, and I decided that I'd come at 4:15, and I'd watch the rest of the game. Well, I got to the playing hall at 4:15, and lo and behold, it was all over already. Spassky had sealed a very bad move, and he'd resigned at once without even waiting for Korchnoi's reply. Now, the strange thing is that Spassky claimed that his position hadn't been lost. According to Spassky, he resigned in protest against the dishonesty of the chief arbiter, that's Karzic, and Dr. Erva. Well, I intend to give the final position of the 18th game later on in this tape, so you can make up your own minds about that. But as to Karzic and Erva being dishonest, I really can't agree with that. Our feeling was that Karzic and Erva were doing really too much to protect Spassky when Spassky was behaving illegally. And I think that this accusation of dishonesty on the part of the two officials merely shows that Spassky was in an extremely disturbed state of mind. Now, Korchnoi won the match by 10.5 to 7.5. It was a convincing victory. Not quite as great as it should have been, but good enough. But I'd like to speculate now on why Spassky behaved in this odd fashion. Now, you may remember that 9 years ago, Spassky defeated Korchnoi really crushingly in the candidates' final at Kiev. In that match, there were 10 games played. Spassky won 4, Victor won 1, and there were 5 draws. And I think that this decisive victory of Spassky against Korchnoi so long ago meant that Spassky completely underestimated Korchnoi. I think that he dismissed Korchnoi in his mind as a kind of dangerous eccentric. One had to be careful with him, but one didn't really need to fear him. And when Spassky lost 4 games out of the first 9, and didn't even manage to win any, I think that something snapped in his mind, and he somehow lost his mental balance. And I think it was this that was responsible for his very, very strange behaviour from game 10 onwards. Now, Spassky's always enjoyed a great reputation as a tremendous gentleman in chess. There aren't very many leading grandmasters one would automatically accuse of being a gentleman. But Spassky's always had this reputation, and deservedly so. In the English press, for example, when I got back to London, I discovered that many of the commentators on the match who hadn't been at Belgrade, for example, Harry Gollenbeck, had a quite false impression of what was going on, simply because they couldn't believe that Spassky had behaved in this absurd fashion. They were automatically conditioned into believing that Spassky would behave like a gentleman, and somehow they've managed to apportion most of the blame for this crisis that blew up at Belgrade onto Korchnoi, which was absolutely wrong. I said before that Spassky claimed the final position of the 18th game wasn't lost for him, and he said that he'd resigned in protest against the dishonest behaviour of the arbiter, Karzic, and Dr. Erver. Well, before I go on to an analysis of some complete games, let me give you the final position of the match. You can set it up on a chessboard, and you can come to your own conclusion. I'm fairly sure that some analysis amongst yourselves or some friends will demonstrate to you that Spassky is completely lost in this final position. I don't want to prejudice you by giving my own variations, but you'll see some in the book I've written of the match if you get hold of that. So here's the final position by which you can test the objectivity of Spassky's accusations. Spassky was white, Korchnoi black. White pieces first. White king f2. White queen c4. White rook g1. White knight on f3. White bishop on e2. And white pawns on a4, b5, d4, and e5. Black king on h8. Queen on h6. Rook on f8. Bishops on f4 and g6. f4 and g6. Pawns on h7, b7 and a5. h7, b7 and a5. Now Spassky sealed 41, queen from c4 to c3, and then he resigned without waiting for the move bishop f4 to d2. That finished the match in Korchnoi's favour, 10.5, 7.5. Now let's take a look at a few positions and games that arose in the match. The first one I want to examine is a position that cropped up in game number 7. Now please set up the following position on your board. White king on g1. White queen on b6. White rooks on d1 and c6. White pawns on h2, g2, f2, e3, and c7. Korchnoi is white. Now Spassky's position, the black pieces, black king on g8, black queen on a2, black rooks on d7 and c8, d7 and c8, and black pawns on h6, g7, e5, d2, and a5. Now in this position, Korchnoi played his 30th move, pawn to h3. Please return the pawn from h3 to h2. The question is, why did Korchnoi not play his queen from b6 to b7? White queen from b6 to b7. Now, various masters and grandmasters have analysed this game. I might mention Timon, Larsen, Hartston, as some of the most eminent. And all of them agreed in giving the move pawn to h3 one or two exclamation marks, and every one of them rejected queen b7 on account of the reply black queen from a2 to a4. Well, that is true, but the simple answer Queen A4 does not bring the matter to an end. And as an exercise, I'd like you to examine this position and see if you can work out the full scale of the complications that arise after playing the black queen from A2 to A4. Now, I'll encourage you by saying that neither Hartston nor Larsen, nor indeed Timon, who devoted quite a lot of space to analysing this game in the Dutch chess magazine, none of them found the right variation after Queen A4. Well, I'll give you a clue. White's first move is Queen on B7 takes Black Rook on C8 check. And Black's King goes to H7. Now you have to find a move for White. Switch off for a while and think about it. Well, what did you find? The best move is Queen from C8 to H8 check. Black King takes White Queen on H8. Now White makes a new queen. Pawn from C7 to C8 equals Queen check. Black King goes back to H7. Now White has won a rook, but he has to cope with threats against his back rank. If you still haven't seen your way to the end of the combination, switch off and have another think. Well, what did you find? If White plays rook on D1, takes pawn on D2, Black could try Queen on A4 to A1 check, but then White wins by playing his rook from C6 to C1. Please replace White's rook on C6 and put the Black Queen back on A4. But Black has a stunning coup in this position that wins at once. That is, Queen from A4 to D1 check. White must take it, and then rook takes rook on D1 is checkmate. Now let's replace the pieces. Black rook back to D7 from D1. Black Queen back on A4. White rook back on D1. And Black's horrible passed pawn back on D2. Well, White only has one move in this position, and that is rook from C6 to C2. Now White's a whole rook up, the passed D pawn is blockaded, and there's no immediate threat on the back rank. But it's Black's move, and he has a very strong possibility. Can you spot it? Maybe you've seen this right from the beginning, but if you haven't, switch off again and think about it. The answer is the thunderbolt, Queen A4 to A1. Bang! And White's completely helpless. Everything he plays leads to a loss. He can resign. Did you find this? If you did find it, you did better than Hartston, Timon, and Larsen. The best game that Spassky won was probably game 11. So now let's take a look at an extract of play from this game. Are you ready? Let's set up the pieces. Korchnoi is white, Spassky is black. White pieces go on the following squares. White king on G1. White queen on B3. White rooks on C1 and D1. White knights on C3 and F3. White bishop on A2. And white pawns on H2, G2, F2, E3, D4, B4, and A4. That's D4, B4, and A4. Now the black position, black king on G8, black queen on D8, black rooks on C7 and E8, black knight on E6, black bishops on A8 and F6, bishops on A8 and F6, and black pawns on H6, G7, F7, D5, C6, B6, and A7. You can see in this position that white has managed to work up an initiative on the queen's side, and is also threatening to gain some leeway in the centre by playing either knight e5 or advancing his pawn to e4. On the other hand, black has quite a solid position, and he's also in possession of the bishop pair, which could become influential if the game opens up. Korchnoi now played a strange move. The move was queen from b3 to b1. But the point of this is to bring more pressure to bear against black's d-pawn when white eventually plays his pawn from b4 to b5. Of course, there's no point attacking the d-pawn with the queen. It's more efficient to attack it with a minor piece. That's why he opens up the line of the bishop from a2 to d5. Spassky's reply was pawn from a7 to a5, which is quite an astute psychological idea. Normally it's bad to advance pawns on the wing where you're being attacked, and in this case it looks rather silly, because an exchange of pawns from b4 to a5 also gives white the c5 square. But this was a kind of trap. White's best move now would have been to play his pawn from b4 to b5. White pawn from b4 to b5. Black must play pawn from c6 to c5. White should take it. d4 takes c5. Black takes back with the rook to defend the d-pawn. And now white should play knight from c3 to e4. Knight from c3 to e4. Now, if black captures on c1, rook c5 takes rook on c1. White plays knight takes f6 check. Queen takes f6. And then either rook takes c1 or queen takes c1. And in both cases, white has the better game, because the bishop on a8 is beginning to look rather stupid. In both cases, black would probably have to try and sacrifice a pawn by means of d5 to d4, but he doesn't get quite enough for it. Now let's replace the pieces. Black rook from c1 to c5. Black queen from f6 to d8. Put white's rook back on c1. Put the black bishop back on f6. And white's knight back on e4. Well, after knight from c3 to e4, Bent Larsen suggested that black's best move was to sacrifice the queen, with d5 takes e4. That's as may be, but I don't believe that black has full equality in this position. He only gets a rook and minor piece for the queen, and there's nothing wrong with white's coordination. Okay, put the black pawn back from e4 to d5, white's knight back on c3, black rook back on c8, remove white's pawn from b5 back to b4, put the black pawn back on c6, and white's d-pawn back on d4. Victor didn't do any of this. At this point, he completely seized up. He was obviously very upset by Spassky's habit of playing from his box. And from this point on, he starts to play really badly. b4 takes a5. Black recaptured. b6 takes a5. They're followed queen from b1 to b6. Queen from b1 to b6. The black rook went from c7 to b7. And white captured on d8. Obviously the c-pawn can't be taken. Black took back on d8 with his rook. Now we can already begin to see the germs of a white disadvantage, in that black is controlling the b-file. Probably the most sensible thing for white to do now would either have been to play his knight from f3 to e5 at once, or to challenge the b-file with rook from c1 to b1. Instead of that, Korchnoi conceived a time-wasting maneuver of playing his knight from f3 to e1 to d3 to e5, instead of putting it there in one move. Knight went from f3 to e1. rook went to b6, black rook to b6, preparing to double in the b file. The knight went from e1 to d3. Black doubled rooks, rook d8 to b8. And now white played pawn to h3. Black bishop went to b7. And now again white could have played for a draw with rook from c1 to b1. One advantage of his maneuver of putting the knight on d3 is that he controls the b4 square. So that after rook b1, black can't anchor a rook on b4. Please put white's rook back from b1 to c1. Instead of that, white played his knight from d3 to e5. A clear sign that something's wrong with white's concentration. As I said before, it wasn't necessary to play the knight from f3 to e1 to d3 to get to this square. Spassky took it off, bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, and now came rook to b4. White's last chance now would have been to play his pawn from e3 to e4. White pawn from e3 to e4. And after the natural reply, pawn from d5 to d4, the knight should come from c3 to e2, and then white can make a draw by playing his bishop from a2, takes the knight on e6, and capturing on d4 at some later stage. This was white's last chance to hold the game. Please put the knight back on c3 from e2, black pawn back on d5, and the white pawn back on e3. Instead of that, white played a really feeble move. White pawn from f2 to f3. And now Spassky increases his advantage decisively and effectively. Bishop to a6, rook to d2, bishop to c4, white pawn to f4, another wasted tempo, black knight to c5. Now there's no question that white has to lose material. White rook went to d4. This loses the exchange, by the way. Black knight went to d3. White rook to d1. Knight to b2. Rook to c1. Black pawn to c5. Now there's nothing for it but to sacrifice the rook, but the compensation is absolutely inadequate. Rook takes d5, bishop takes d5, bishop takes d5, pawn to c4, knight from c3 to e4, knight b2 takes pawn on a4, and Korchnoi resigned. Even if he picks up black's f-pawn, there's nothing to be done against black's passed queen's rook's pawn. From a purely chess point of view, this was probably Spassky's best game. But after this game, Korchnoi issued a very sharp protest against Spassky's method of playing from the box. Now, something perhaps I should point out. Towards the end of this game, Korchnoi was in serious time trouble, and Spassky came to the board to play his moves. But, as can be seen from photographs of the match, when Spassky was sitting at the board, he didn't study the pieces at the board. He turned round and looked at the central demonstration board. So he was staring up at an angle of 45 degrees. My next example is the adjourned position of the 17th game. Please set up the pieces as follows. White king on e2, white bishop on d4, bishop on d for Donald 4, white rook on c5, white pawns on h2, g3, f3, e3, and b2. Black pieces, king on g6, knight on g5, rook on d7, pawns on b3, d5, f6, g7, and h5. h5. Now in this position, Korchnoi had to seal his 41st move, and it was obvious that this move would be 41, rook on c5 to b5, winning black's b-pawn. But now I'd like to try and describe the situation at the adjournment to give some idea of the flavour of the match. Spassky had already left the stage, and Korchnoi was sitting alone at the board in deep thought. The auditorium was packed. There were probably about 2,000 people there. And I was watching it with Michael Steen and my wife and Petra Lerverick from a theatre box on the left-hand side of the auditorium facing the stage. Now, as Korchnoi sat there pondering his move, the audience erupted into enthusiastic support for him. They started shouting at the tops of their voices, "Korchnoi, Korchnoi, Korchnoi! He's winning, he's winning," and other such phrases, though of course in Serbo-Croat. Then they started to swarm round our theatre box. Some of them reached up and tried to congratulate us, others tried to kiss Petra Lerverick's hand. The whole auditorium was in tumult, because they could see that Korchnoi was going to win at pawn, and also because they were now almost 100% behind him, after the way Spassky had behaved. Well, at this point, the arbiter decided that the noise was too much, and although it was basically in support of Korchnoi, he shouldn't be bothered by it. So Karzic ordered that the theatre curtain should be closed. And the adjournment of the 17th game, was a really fantastic scene. It was more like grand opera than chess. There was Korchnoi sitting on the stage, with the two theatre curtains moving in slowly from each side, and the audience erupting, going wild, shouting out enthusiastic comments, bubbling over with support for him in the auditorium. It was really incredible. Anyway, having given you this brief atmospheric description, I'll show you what happened in the second session of the 17th game. Spassky's reply to the sealed move, rook b5, was knight from g5 to e6. Obviously, he has to try and steer for rook and pawn endgame. That's his best chance of salvation. Korchnoi took on b3, rook takes b3, knight takes d4 check. Korchnoi took back, pawn e3 takes d4, and now Spassky played a very weak move, rook from d7 to c7. Once again, this was a clear case of the inferiority of the Russian adjournment analysis compared with ours. After many, many hours of analysis, we'd established that the best defense was, please put the rook back on d7, Spassky's king to f5, white king to d3, black pawn to h4, white rook to b5, black pawn to h3. After a whole night and a following morning and afternoon of analysis, we came to the conclusion that this was probably a win, but it's very, very difficult. After Spassky's move, things go very quickly. Please put black's pawn back on h5, Spassky's king back on g6, the white king back on e2, white's rook back on b3, and now Spassky's actual 43rd move, rook to c7. There followed white king to d3, black rook to c1. Of course, black makes his rook active in this way, but he also loses touch with his important d-pawn. And once white's got two passed pawns on the queen side, it's all over. White rook to b5, black rook checked on d1, white king went to e3, black rook checked again, on e1, white king went to f4, black rook to e2, white pawn to h4, black king to h6, and now white advanced his passed pawn, pawn to b4, rook to b2, white king to f5. The point of this is to come around and capture the d-pawn. Black rook went to b3. And now perhaps you care to consider white's next move. Switch off and think about it. White's 51st move was pawn to f4. It's obvious enough, really. It's better to lose the g-pawn and the h-pawn than to lose the f-pawn and the g-pawn. The decisive factor will be the advance of white's d-pawn and b-pawn in conjunction, against which black can do nothing. Strangely enough, Spassky didn't bother to take the g-pawn. He played his king from h6 to h7. He's lost in any case, but that's really rather a useless move. White king went to e6. Black's king went back to g6. Very subtle, but I don't understand it. White king takes on d5. Black's rook takes on g3. White king to c6. Black king to f7. Rook takes pawn. Now white's 2 up. Rook to g4. Pawn to knight 5. White pawn to b5. Rook takes f-pawn. White pawn to b6. And now black resigned. There's absolutely no way to hold up the b-pawn. Finally, I'm going to analyse one complete game. It's the second game, one of the best of the match. Spassky was white, Korchnoi black. Please put your pieces in the starting position. Pawn to e4, white pawn to e4, black pawn to e6. French defence. It's one of Korchnoi's favourites, and before this match, he never lost a really important game with it. You may remember that he used it against Karpov in the candidates final in 1974, and every game was a draw. White's second move, pawn to d4, black pawn to d5, white knight to c3. Many grandmasters, including Karpov, prefer to avoid the sharp positions that arise from this move, opting for Tarash's quieter 3 knight d2. However, Spassky has always preferred this move, and it shows a quite sporting attitude on his part. As could be expected, Korchnoi now employed the Vernava or Nimzowitsch variation, which is the sharpest line of the French defence. Black bishop to b4, white pawn to e5, black pawn to c5, counter-attacking against the centre, white pawn to a3, bishop takes knight check, pawn takes bishop. This is the basic position of the Vernava, and now black has two main choices, either knight from g8 to e7, or queen from d8 to c7. The latter of these is more positional. Let's take a look. Black queen to c7, white queen to g4, and now black can play either pawn to f5 or pawn to f6, defending his g-pawn laterally, and then planning to continue with the fianchetto of the queen's bishop, or rather a pseudo-fianchetto, b6 followed by bishop a6. Anyway, the more dynamic procedure is to play the knight to e7 on move 6. Please put white's queen back on d1, black queen back on d8, and play knight from g8 to e7. This shows that black isn't afraid to sacrifice his kingside pawns in return for a central initiative. White queen went to g4. Other alternatives are knight f3 or a4, which Spassky tried later in the match. And now came pawn on c5 takes white pawn on d4. It's a matter of taste now whether white recaptures, or whether he decides to obliterate black's kingside. In this game, Spassky opted for obliteration. Queen takes pawn g7. Rook g8. Queen takes h7. Queen to c7. Hitting e5 and c3. Now white can choose between king d1 or knight e2, and knight e2 was the move Spassky played. Obviously, he doesn't want to give up the chance of castling yet. Black played his queen's knight, the one on b8 to c6, threatening to wipe out white's centre. Spassky defended his pawn, f4. Black bishop went to d7. Now, you may care to consider what black's reply is to the apparently crushing 12, pawn on c3 takes pawn on d4. Play that move on the board, switch off and think about it. Black has a decisive response. Knight on c6 takes pawn on d4. White must recapture, and the black queen comes to c3, check, and white's finished. Please put black's queen back on c7, black knight back on c6, white knight on e2 from d4, the black pawn back on d4, and the white pawn back on c3. White actually tried to consolidate by playing his queen from h7 to d3. And now black took on c3. Pawn d4 takes pawn on c3. In this position, white has a number of moves. He can play his rook to b1, his pawn to h4. He can take on c3 with the knight or the queen. He can play knight g3. Or he can even play 13 rook to a2. But none of these moves alters the basic strategic contour of the position. And that is that black has a lot of play in the center, where he still has a kind of majority, on the king side, where he controls the g file, and in the c file even, for his pawn or his pawns. Now if white ever captures on c3, he'll open up the c file for black's counterattack. And wherever white tries to put his king, he'll find difficulties. On the king's side, there are open lines of black's rooks, or maybe for a black bishop bearing down from c6, while the queen side is completely broken up, and white's king would have great difficulty in finding a shelter. So this is very interesting. Normally, Spassky likes the initiative. He likes to sacrifice pawns for the attack. But now we see the roles reversed. Usually they say that Korchnoi is a great defender who likes to seize material and hangs on grimly into the endgame. But I think a subtle change has occurred in Korchnoi's play, and now he very much likes to have the initiative. He likes to attack himself, and he relies very much on instinct to tell him whether he's got enough compensation for his sacrificed material. So anybody who thinks that the match against Karpov later this year is going to see a grim defensive Korchnoi trying to snatch pawns and win long endgames may be in for a shock. I think we'll find quite a few dashing attacking games by Korchnoi in that match, conforming to his new style. Well, Spassky's actual 13th move choice was a very sensible developing move, bishop from c1 to e3. And he had, in fact, employed this in a game against Doroshkovich, I think, about 12 years ago. But of course, we made a deep study of Spassky's games before the match, and we knew about it. And we prepared a theoretical innovation, which casts some doubt on bishop e3. Black pawn from d5 to d4. A very nice pawn sacrifice that keeps the initiative firmly in black's camp. It doesn't make much difference whether white captures the pawn now or on the next move. Black will always get a lot of pressure, augmented by the position of the bishop on c6, which can come to c6, no longer obstructed by the d-pawn. Another point of this sacrifice is that it lends some foundation to the far-flung pawn on c3, which is now stuck in white's throat. Spassky played his bishop to f2, black castle queenside, white took on d4 with the knight, black took back, knight takes d4, Spassky took with the queen, and black defended his a-pawn, pawn from b7 to b6. The white bishop went to h4. Clearly, Spassky believed that since he was a pawn ahead, he ought to carry out some exchanges. Bishop from d7 to b5. White queen to e4. Black bishop takes bishop on f1. Now you should think very carefully about this position. What would you play here? Would you carry on playing for a win with white? Or would you try and play for a draw? And if so, how? If I'd been white in this position, I must confess I would have decided to opt for the draw, because black has a lot of play in the g file and the d file, more than enough for his sacrificed pawn. But the question is how to play for a draw. This game was annotated by several players, leading players I might add, none of whom spotted that a draw was possible. Switch off and see if you can find the draw. The answer is queen from e4 to a8 check, black king to d7, that's forced by the way, castle's queenside check, knight d5, rook takes d5 check, pawn takes, queen takes d5 check, king c8, queen a8 check, draw by perpetual check. Please replace the pieces. White queen on e4, white king on e1, white rook on a1, black knight on e7, black pawn on e6. Instead of that, Spassky played rook on h1 takes bishop on f1. Black rook went to d5, breaking the pin, and threatening to introduce his knight into the attack, so Spassky hacked it off. Bishop takes knight, black queen takes bishop. Now this is still a highly dangerous position for white. It's quite clear that castling will be out of the question. His king's still stuck in the centre, and he hasn't been able to develop his queen's rook. For a while, Spassky continues to defend well, but I suspect that he was overestimating his chances all the time. Maybe that's why he lost the game. White rook went to f3. Black king went to b8. And now Spassky missed his best chance. It's very hard to find. I won't try and make you find it. It was only pointed out by Nydorf long after the game was over. The best move is white pawn to g3, black rook to d2, rook takes pawn on c3, and now if black takes on h2, white castles queenside with a winning position. So black has to play his rook from g8 to d8. And now he still has enough compensation for his sacrificed pawns. The point is that white still can't get his queen's rook into play, and black certainly shouldn't lose this position. Please put black's rook back on g8 from d8, from d2 to d5, white rook from c3 to f3, give black his pawn on c3 back, and replace the pawn from g3 to g2. Instead of that, white played a rather feeble move, king e1 to f1. The black rook went to d2, black rook from d5 to d2, and white carried on trying to exchange off the dangerous attacking pieces. White rook from f3 to f2. Black moved his other rook into the attack, rook from g8 to d8. White queen went to f3. Rook takes rook check. King takes rook. Rook to d2 check. Now, if the white king moves to the back rank, the reply queen from e7 to c5 is really annoying, especially because white can't really defend his c-pawn very easily. Here's a variation. White king to f1, black queen to c5, white rook to d1, black rook takes pawn on c2, rook to d7, counterattack, queen to c4 check, king to g1, rook to c1 check, rook d1, queen d4 check, and white can resign. Now let's replace the pieces. Black queen on e7, black rook on d2, white rook on a1, white pawn on c2, White king on f2. So white had to venture out into the open with his king. King from f2 to g3. Black queen to d8. White queen to e4. Of course, he can't take on c3 because of queen g8 check. But queen g8 check came anyway. Black queen to g8 check. White king to h3. Queen to h8 check. King to g3. Queen to g7 check. King to h3. And now black's rook rushed back. Rook to d8. One of the things I like about this game is the way that black's major pieces harass white from different directions. First of all, they invade white's position, then they retreat, then they invade it again. White is hammered from all directions just by black's queen and rook. Now white has to make a hole for his king. He played his pawn from g2 to g4. Black rook went to h8 check. King went to g3. Queen to h6. They're only on the h-file temporarily. They're going to come back to the center fairly soon. Queen to g2. That's forced. Queen to h4 check. King to f3. And now the switch of fronts again. Black rook from h8 back to d8. The point of all these maneuvers by black is that white's pawn front on the king side has been horribly loosened, and now there's absolutely no safe square for the white's king at all. Such situations are always lost in practice, if not in the theory. White queen went to g3, hoping for an exchange, but in vain. Queen back to e7. And now white's last chance was to bring his queen's rook into play at last, by playing his rook from a1 to e1, although that means abandoning the a-pawn. Instead of that, he played his pawn from g4 to g5. In a way, that's quite sensible, because it makes some more squares for the king. But black is given time for a decisive attack. Rook to d2. Black rook to d2. White king to g4. Black queen to b7. Queen takes pawn on c3. Rook to g2 check. King to h3. Rook to f2. King to g4. Queen to e4. Decisive centralization. Spassky's got no defense at all. Now he resigned the game, and the audience of 1,000 rose to their feet and applauded for 5 minutes. It's curious that white's never had the time to move his queen's rook in this game. It's very unusual that a top grandmaster like Spassky can lose a 40-move game where the queen's rook doesn't make one move at all. Well, that was one of the best games of the match, in my opinion. Michael Steen and I will also be Korchnoi seconds for the World Championship against Karpov, probably in July or August, with Hamburg as a probable venue. And I can promise you that there'll be some really exciting games in that match, and I hope to present them to you in a later cassette. Finally, I would like to mention that I have written a book on the Korchnoi Spassky match. It's called Korchnoi Spassky Chess Crisis, and it will be published by Allen and Unwin on February the 23rd at £1.95. This book contains all the games with my notes. It is difficult for me to substantiate the claims I have made here about Spassky's behavior, since it's obviously impossible to provide original documents on a tape. But I hope that anyone who may feel that I have been unduly biased towards Korchnoi on the tape will take the trouble to examine the book. My book comes to the same conclusions as the tape, but its objectivity is considerably enhanced by the publication of all the official documents from every side, issued not only by Korchnoi, but by Spassky and the chief arbiter Karzic. I have also included plans and diagrams of the stage, which will clarify the explanations I've given here.